My name is Leo Bagdasarian, and I'm the managing director of the San Francisco Bastiat Society. Today we have a really cool guest, Dr. Richard Salzman. He is joining us from the East Coast. Just a little bit about the Bastiat side of San Francisco and AIER. AIER was founded in 1933. It's one of the oldest nonpartisan organizations. To learn more about AIER, please visit aier.org. Or you could also visit sfbastiat.com, where you can see our previous events, follow us, and learn more about Bastiat. Our speaker today is Dr. Richard Salzman. He's a president of Intermarket Forecasting, professor of political economy at Duke University, and a fellow at AIER. He's also the author of, as you can see in his background, a new book called Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? It is a collection of essays, and it's a collection of essays Dr. Salzman wrote within the last 10, 20 years. And it reads much like Hazlitt and Bastiat. It's clear, it's easy to follow. You do not be intimidated by the fact that it's about 500 pages, because you could easily knock this book out in about 2 weeks. The cool thing about this book is you could jump around and pick a topic that you like. It's structured in a way that it flows really well from topic to topic. And lastly, what is essential about this book is it reads much like Ayn Rand, where Dr. Salzman clearly defines topics and guides readers through them. With that being said, Dr. Salzman, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Great to be here. Thank you so much, Leo, for inviting me. It's great to share your audience, and congratulations with the great job done out in San Francisco with Bastiat Society. I know you guys are going to do great things. Yeah, I thought what we do today, and Leo and I talked about this beforehand, there is a section, and I'll show you some exhibits and things from the book, but there's a particular section on crisis. And the title of the section is Crises, Real and Exaggerated. And so I thought I would focus on that first, and then we can broaden the discussion beyond that. But just before I go through the book and some of its components, in 1987, there was a very fascinating book put out by a scholar named Robert Higgs, and it was called Crisis and Leviathan. And for those of you who know political theory, political economy, Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes from 1651 is kind of a stand-in word for big and oppressive and invasive government. And so that's the Leviathan part. And this was a very widely read book at the time. And Higgs, I believe, is still alive. He works at the Independent Institute. But his theme was that government grows, and in a bad way. It becomes more authoritarian, it becomes more invasive, it becomes more illiberal. It takes liberties from us, specifically during crises. And then the question becomes, what is the crisis? Why does government get bigger afterwards or during it? Now, sometimes he would say it was war, sometimes it would be diseases, sometimes it would be natural disasters. But our financial crises, so we can talk about all those. But his finding, and you could measure this as well, was that when the crisis occurred, the government stepped up and said, we must do something, we must have emergency powers. And now often these powers were extra constitutional. They were temporary measures, that people put up with because they thought it was temporary, precisely because the whole idea of a crisis is something acute, not chronic. It's going to go away soon. We're going to get our liberties back, or we're going to get the tax rates back down. And what he noticed is there was, after the crisis, or after the war, say, there was a reduction of from what the peak of government spending or regulating might have been, but it never got back to the prior level, pre-crisis. So he was charting over the time a kind of ratcheting up of government's invasiveness in the economy and in people's civil liberties over time due to these crises. And he thought it was a problem, but also he suggested, as I do in my book, that often those who want such power might even in some cases concoct or fabricate crises, and precisely so they could accumulate such powers. Now that's a little more of a devious take on things, you know, that someone would be so inclined to want to increase government power that they would go out and create a crisis. Now the other key thing in his theme and in mine as well is the crisis cannot be attributed to government itself. To see what would happen if government was known to have caused the crisis, then it would be much more difficult for it to accumulate power, especially to accumulate improper powers during the crisis, because people would say, no, government caused the crisis. So if anything, we should be ratcheting down government's involvement and not ratcheting it up. So let me just talk with that as background. That definitely informs my interpretation of crises very much. Let me just mention what I think the three big ones of the last 20 years. And I'm focusing on the last 20 years because in the book, I make a very clear distinction between the first 20 years of this century and the last 20 years of the last century. They're almost like night and day. I'll go into this more, but the 1980 to 2000 period was moving toward capitalism and away from statism and all its varieties. The last 20 years are going in the other direction. It's very sad. We're going in the direction away from capitalism. This not just in the America, but also pretty much in the rest of the world. So I'll talk about that, but that's part of what I'm really asking about. Where have all the capitalists gone? Meaning, where have the advocates of capitalism gone? We saw them in the last 20 years of the last century. They seem to have disappeared in the first 20 years of this century. But back to crises, there's been three big ones in the last 20 years. And the government role in this and reaction to this is very informative. All right, so the first one, 9/11, the terrorist attack on America at 9/11. The second one, the financial crisis of 08-09. The third one, we're really still living through, the COVID, the virus that came from Wuhan, China. Now, let me just take these three from the perspective of cause, and then we'll talk about effects. Clearly, each of them are crises. By the way, I think the word crisis is overused. As I said before, a crisis is acute and usually brief. So you can't have like a crisis that goes on every day for years on end. The whole idea of a crisis is it's a severe, unnatural, unexpected thing. It's traumatic. You know, so think of like an emergency room in a hospital. That's a crisis. That's a crisis setting. You know, it's life or death, and there are heroes and rescues and things like that. It's not, you know, a long-term hospital stay of, you know, interminable proportions. So that's the first thing. And I think that's an interesting thing to note, because if you hear repeatedly that we're in this crisis or that crisis, we're in a climate crisis and a financial crisis and a this crisis and a that crisis, it kind of drains the word of any real meaning anymore. And then you start to suspect that people are looking to grab power by proliferating crises, right? So I'm going to stick to the idea that there have been three big ones in the last 20 years, and I would not include climate change as a crisis. 9/11, what caused that? It would be hard to say that capitalism caused that. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? If the government is going to grow in power after 9/11, what, due to some kind of capitalist failure, that is almost impossible for anyone to claim. To what extent was Washington responsible for it? Now, it was in many ways what they call a sucker punch, a unexpected, you know, internal job of hijacking airplanes and things like that. So you can't, I don't think, hold Defense Department or other officials totally responsible for being affected in that way. However, in the years prior, there was a lot of appeasement of terrorism by the US government and the State Department. There was an unwillingness to take on the Islamic threat. And to that extent, you could say the US government was, you know, I wouldn't say complicit, that's too much of a conspiracy theory, but responsible for the failure of national defense. Most economists, even though they debate about public goods, like what goods and services government should provide, none of them dispute the idea that national defense is one of them. The minimalist government folks, me included, would say something like national defense, police, and courts. That at minimum, unless you're an anarchist, at minimum, the minarchist, minimalist government should provide national defense against foreign enemies, police to go after internal criminals, and then a court system just to arbitrate disputes among reasonable people. In that regard, 9/11 was a failure of a major function of government. There's no doubt about it. It was a major failure of the US government to protect its citizens from attack. All right, so let me just set that aside for a moment. A little bit on the outcome of that. We know we just finished a 20-year involvement in Afghanistan. Was that really necessary? Trillions of dollars spent on Iraq and Afghanistan. The Taliban is still there. They're stronger than ever. We left them a lot of military equipment. It's just a disaster all the way around. So not only were we exposed on 9/11 in a way that the government failed, I think you can say that its response has been a failure. The threat remains. The taking away of civil liberties has gone on. The Patriot Act was signed right after 9/11. In 2002, I believe it was. The Patriot Act is known for eviscerating in a major way US privacy, financial privacy, other kinds of privacy. We know that the Fourth Amendment has been violated significantly at the airports, where you're exposed to all sorts of searches and seizures of things that are, I consider, unreasonable. So let's set that aside for a moment. A complete disaster as far as I'm concerned, 9/11 and the response, the insufficient response to it. And yet it has been trenching on our liberties ever since. Now, the financial crisis. I teach students at Duke, and increasingly they were just little babies when this happened. But a couple of years back, when they were a little older, I would ask them, what do you think caused the financial crisis of 08 and 09? I mean, guess what they would say? Most people would say, greed on Wall Street, mortgage-backed securities, fraud, Bernie Madoff, all that would come out, financialization. The standard view is that was a failure of capitalism. So once again, the response, well, I'll talk about in a moment, but let me give you briefly, and that there's a lot on this in the book, because there's not only sections on crisis, there's a section on money and banking that deals with this. You have, starting with really Clinton in the late 90s, but then really accelerated under George W. Bush, a deliberate national policy of increasing the home ownership rate. Now just think of that, the home ownership rate. It was about 65% in 2000, 2002, before this program really ramped up, meaning 65% of households in America owned a home and lived in it. Now, what does that mean? That the rest of the country was homeless? No, the rest rented apartments or rented houses or in condos and things like that, right? So now what would contribute to a home ownership rate of any rate? People making decisions on whether to buy or rent, but they do that all the time with cars. Shall I buy a car or lease a car? Or should I buy ski equipment or should I rent ski equipment? You know, so the whole issue of buying and renting in order to get, in this case, what amounts to housing, it should really be left to the market. It really shouldn't be something where the government says, we have some ideal home ownership rate, which we must target or we must increase. And that was their view. Their view was, we need to increase the home ownership rate. And we need to therefore apply public policies, maybe even alter public policies to increase the home ownership rate. Okay, so that was really the goal, it was a national goal. For those free marketers out there, when you hear national goal, you should think of central planning. You should think of like, why would government think it knows best what the home ownership rate is? All right, so that's one thing. But the other thing they did was they said, notice the home ownership rate is different depending on race. All right, so if the overall home ownership rate in the US was 65%, they would look and they would notice, well, that's only the average. If you look at the home ownership rates of whites, it was something like 74%. And for the, what was the next biggest group? Asians, and then Latinos, and then Blacks. And they would say, well, Black home ownership rate is something like 45% or so. So you get the idea that the 65% is an average that masks a wide variation. And the argument was there's something wrong. Not only is the home ownership rate not high enough, but the gap between home ownership rates and between whites and Black is a problem. And so it wasn't just a policy to artificially boost the home ownership rate. It was to artificially boost the home ownership rate for those who were really lower in terms of home ownership rates, Blacks and Latinos. Okay. From a banker's perspective, you could argue that they have their own, everyone has their own motivation, as I said before, as to whether to own or rent. But in the particular case of low ownership rates for Blacks and Latinos, the theory in government was that it was due to racism, that it was not due to bankers judging the credit worthiness of borrowers. The argument was Blacks don't own homes to the rate of others because they're being discriminated against. They're perfectly creditworthy, it was argued, and yet racist bankers were preventing them from owning homes. All right, long story short, to remedy this alleged problem, the government agencies that help finance mortgages, which in my view shouldn't even exist, but if you remember, they were called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and in some cases the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration. They changed their policies deliberately to make it easier for mortgages to be issued to people who couldn't afford homes. That is the bottom line of what happened. And if you know anything about home finance, the basic idea is you borrow. Yes, you do borrow the bulk of the purchase price of a home, but to show that you have a self-interest in owning the home and that you actually own it, you put in a down payment. You make a down payment. Sometimes it's 20%. Sometimes it's a little less than that. The specific government policy was to lower that down payment as low as possible, to make it as affordable as possible. They would change the rules and they would say, well, now government will guarantee loans, even for people who put very little down, in some cases, zero down, no money put down, whatever, meaning the entire purchase price of the house was borrowed. Well, if you know anything about incentives and self-interest, the less money you have involved in the purchase of a thing, obviously the less you care about it, the less you own it. And in this case, the idea was, well, let me borrow all this money. I'll get a home. If I can't afford it and I default on the loan, it'll just go back to the bank, and the bank is taking the house as collateral. And it's really no loss to you because you didn't put any money into the purchase of the home. This is really ultimately what led to the financial crisis of 08-09. It was not Wall Street greed. It was not, speculative excess. It was not the house prices are in a bubble, all the things we hear, deregulation. There's a range of things that people claimed caused the financial crisis of 08-09, but it was really caused by this artificial government, this policy of government artificially trying to boost the home ownership rate of people who basically couldn't afford homes. And if you can't afford homes, you're eventually going to default. And if securities are created that create like baskets of these loans, well, those securities themselves will go bad. They'll default as well. So a cascade of mortgage defaults basically occurred with a lag, and all the securities associated with those payments also. So financial institutions obviously got in trouble because they were holding these things. We know what happened in the aftermath. Oh, by the way, guess what happened to the home ownership rate after the financial crisis? It declined significantly. So there was like an artificial boost from 65% to maybe, 67%. But at the end of the financial crisis, there were so many defaults and so many people leaving homes that the home ownership rate was lower at the end of the process than at the beginning. So talk about defeating your purpose. The purpose itself was wrong, but that was the result. What else was the result? Huge bank bailouts, huge. The TARP, it was called TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. It was 800 billion at the time. This sounds like small change now when we're hearing about trillions, but at the time, 2008-09, an 800 or 900 billion dollar check from the Treasury to the banks was huge. It was a huge thing. And it was done almost overnight. There was almost no discussion of it in Congress. They were just panicking. They were just scrambling. And people like Barack Obama, who hadn't yet won the presidency, remember, he didn't win office until November 08. The TARP was passed about a month prior to that, and Obama voted for it. So the same, and a lot of the Democrats did. So it was a bipartisan approval of this process. There was not anyone really saying, listen, this is government's fault. We should maybe get rid of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That wasn't true. They are still there today, those two agencies. And so the conclusion was not that government failed yet again, and we need to pare back government's involvement in the financial and mortgage sector at all. It was just pinned on capitalism. You remember later, he does this all the time, Obama would try to get votes by being populist and referring to bankers as fat cats, these fat cats on Wall Street, these cronies, these crony capitalists, right? Well, Obama funded them with bailouts as much as anyone else. So he's created these fat cats, created these cronies. All right, the last one, this will be a little more controversial possibly, but COVID. If you look today and see the analysis, it basically says something like, yes, the economy is in a bad way. Yes, there was massive unemployment in 2020 and 2021. The violence in the streets in the US, granted, related more to George Floyd than to COVID, but still the tremendous and unprecedented turmoil and tumult of the last 2 years associated with COVID, which pretty much left China in the late 2019 period. The reaction to this has been absolutely insane and over the top. The US government in its role, and not just the US government, other governments, the UK and elsewhere, Australia, really terrible. Let's start with the fact that this came from China. This came from a lab in China, a government-run lab in China, partially funded by Anthony Fauci and his group in Washington. So that isn't capitalism. I mean, this is not some pharma company that was dickering around with lethal viruses and let them go. Can you imagine if that was the case? If COVID-19 is something that escaped the lab of some profit-seeking pharma company, the executives would have been summarily shot by now. Instead, it came out of a Chinese government, and to this day, it has not been held accountable for that. It's certainly not being asked to pay reparations to the rest of the world. Everybody worries about reparations when you harm someone. Where are the reparations from China? But quite apart from China, why would the problem be multiplied by a ridiculous US and other government response by locking down economies, by telling people they don't have any right to go to work, by distinguishing essential from non-essential workers, from then turning around and saying, well, if people aren't working because we told them they now can't pay their mortgages, let's send them checks. Let's send them free money from the government. Got from where? From taxpayers who are doing what? Working? They're not supposed to be working. By printing money, by borrowing money, lots of money, trillions of dollars of money. Yes, the vaccines were developed, which is great, but we really should be applauding Pfizer and Moderna and the others who created these vaccines. But now we're on a jag of mandatory vaccines, right? So more, just more of the same, illiberal, irrational policies associated with a virus, which itself was caused by a government. It's ridiculous, it's unnecessary, in many ways it's phobic. I mean, it's not that this virus isn't a serious killer of certain people in certain groups, mostly older, mostly with pre-existing conditions and things like that, but that's no reason to be locking down an entire economy. One of the essays I wrote for AIER during this, very early on, and ended up in the book, it's called Unwealthy is Unhealthy. And it was taking issue with this idea that we could shut down the economy, we could send people home, we could send them checks, and somehow this wouldn't have any deleterious effect on their psychology, on their motivations, on their friendships, and things like that. And it certainly did. It was unhealthy. So on top of the mismanagement of the virus itself, you had this knock-on effect due to the downturn of the economy. It's been well documented, by the way, way before this happened. It was always documented by economists that when there are economic depressions, when there are financial crashes, even when there's recessions, when people lose their job, just in the regular business cycle, there's a real deterioration in people's health, in people's self-esteem, in terms of people's, suicide rates go up, drinking goes up, domestic violence goes up, and all of that has been going up enormously over the last year and a half due to government lockdowns. So again, the issue here is yet another crisis, a crisis really caused by and aggravated by government, and yet it's gaining more power. So each of these three crises, 2001, 2009, 2020, real crises, there's no doubt about it, they were real crises, but they were caused by government mismanagement or government neglect. And then the end result of it was more government power, not less. So it's a very disturbing set of sequences in that regard. I thought, if it's okay, Leo, I thought I would now share just a couple slides on the book. Is that okay?
Yeah, please, by all means. And then we'll have a little discussion and transition into Q&A.